Well, welcome everyone to the America's One webinar presenting a research project on America's values. My name is Mark Nuttall. I am the founder and CEO of America's One. We initiated this research because we were concerned about what was continuing to be growing dissatisfaction and lack of trust in government by the American public. It was across all boards and boundaries. It didn't matter on party, ideology, or age, ethnicity. Americans were losing confidence in their government. We were concerned about this, and also if in fact they're losing confidence, where are they defaulting to? Where are they gravitating to find how they would frame their issues and their values? At the beginning of this research project, about 4 months ago, we had known that 60% plus of America believed that Congress, in particular in government in general, was dishonest, not telling them the truth. They couldn't trust the information they were getting, and they were acting in their own best interest. Well, that would be bad enough. But then while we started the research, it kind of digressed further to this startling account that 65% of the American public doesn't trust candidates running, that they're also deceitful, and that they have a dual agenda, that they're not completely being transparent with. And that is NBC and some other of And then the last, in the middle of all of this research, is the New York Times Siena poll, that 87% of the American public now thinks the country's on the wrong track. Ladies and gentlemen, that's almost the entire population. And so we've done two things with this research. We're trying to decide, what does America believe and why does she believe it? What is driving the values of America today if they don't trust any source of information? And then more importantly, how do we advise candidates in messaging across the board just to regain trust and confidence with the electorate on the issues on which they're running is something that they can take as a foundational element to participate in democracy and have confidence in the future of our country. Now, given that, that's the framework, that's the foundation of what we're doing today. And what we're going to present is a rather large, both in depth and breadth study to you today on our findings. I think you're going to find this very interesting. It was surprising to me. We're fortunate to have George Barna as the organizer and facilitator of this research. George was the leader of both the Barna Group and also the Culture and Faith Institute. He is the authoritative source on cultural values in America. And for the last 40 years has been researching, tracking, analyzing this complex society of democracy that we call the United States of America. He is currently the Director of Research and co-founder of the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He is also an ACU professor focusing on worldview assessment and development and cultural transformation. We're fortunate to have George. And George, I'm going to kick this to you, and thank you very much for the work you've done on this, and we look forward to your findings.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the broadcast here. Thanks for joining us. What I want to do is explain what we did in the research, some of the key findings. It's actually two different projects that were blended together. It was designed that way, that we would do the two projects. But let me explain to you what we did. And in order to make this maybe a little more clear, I'm going to share a number of slides with you that will show you.
George, while you're pulling those up too, by the way, I forgot to tell everybody that if they have questions, to use the chat bar, and we will record those, that we're going to address some questions at the end. There'll also be an email address at the end that they can submit questions to later, and that this is being recorded so that they can pull this down on our website if they want to give it to someone else or weren't able to get all the answers. So I'm sorry for that, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's how we'll handle that after George's presentation. So thanks, George.
Yeah, no problem at all. Glad you did that. So essentially, if we look at the project, our objectives initially were to identify the values that drive the kind of decisions and lifestyles that characterize Americans, and then to look at the relationship of those core values, if you will, to their ideas about and their participation in democracy. Ultimately, what we also wanted to emerge from this with was a series of messages, how to communicate with people about the restoration of America based on those core values and the things that people resonate with. Now, as I mentioned, there were two different parts to this project. The first was a national research study that we did among 2,250 people. And if that seems like an odd number, it was chosen very intentionally because we wanted to look at a large enough sample in each of the 9 census divisions that we could look at each of those 9 geographic divisions individually, but then also put it together to give us a national perspective. So we did that. So it's a large sample, nationally representative of the American adult population, but it was also a longer than usual study. We had 144 questions in the survey. The typical survey lasted 20 to 21 minutes with the respondents. And ultimately what we did was after we pre-tested the questionnaire and then we fielded it, we put it all together, ran the crosstabs, looked at 366 different subgroups across the country. So we're really fine tuning our understanding of many of the different groups. Obviously, we don't have time today to go into the detail on all those, but know that we have it and we're putting that into our larger thinking. The second wave of the research was also a fairly large study, 1,500 respondents, again, representing adults across the country. The emphasis on this one, while the first one was looking at values and issues and character traits, this one was looking at how do we communicate effectively, the whole issue of messaging. Here again, a substantial number of questions, 93 questions. This survey ran a little bit longer than the first one. The average completion time was 22 minutes. The reason for that being that to communicate all these messages, that took more time. But again, when we analyze the data, we're looking at 274 different subgroups coming out of this study. So we're really doing a deep dive through both of these. If we look at what we discovered about the messaging, this is kind of jumping to the bottom line. What did we discover? And then I'll tell you how I think we got there in terms of America's thoughts and feelings. What we discovered is there are probably 5 major things that Americans are thinking about right now. The first and foremost of those may be the economy. What we found is really across the board, people are very, very concerned about the economy. They're looking at inflation, they're looking at the food shortages and how those are expected to expand, the supply chain issues that we know have been in place and continue to be disruptive of the economy, issues related to jobs, government spending, the debt the government has put us in. And so all of those things are uppermost in the minds of Americans. The second key theme for messaging, and this is a very important one, we'll come back to this in a number of ways, has to do with taking care of the family, taking care of, from the respondents' view, my family. They're very family centric. And I think what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years in the nation with the pandemic, the economy, politics, all these things has driven them to sit back and think about what really matters. What do I need to do? And family comes up at the top of the list there. And so they're thinking about their children. They want to make sure that whatever we do as a nation, that we're looking forward so that we can prepare and protect our children for that future. Thinking about how do we allow not only the children, but everybody in the family to grow. Thinking about other kinds of issues, such as taking care of our time and our experiences together, making sure that we maximize those, and also enabling families to have positive experiences together and to make sure that they're free enough to pursue the kind of experiences that they want to have, not that the government or anybody else tells them they need to have. A third kind of message that came out of all this is that Americans are worried about the nature and the quality of the candidates that are running for public office. Americans are telling us they want to see a higher caliber of candidates. They're not satisfied with what's being run out before them by the parties. And so what they're saying is they want to know more about the motives of candidates. Why are they running? And the character of those candidates. Can they be trusted? And other kinds of values that we'll look at. When I put it all together, what I found is what I think are the 5 S's of what Americans want in a candidate. They want a candidate who's getting into a race and who wants to hold public office because they want to be a servant leader. They want to do things that will serve the people. Secondly, they want candidates who are interested in bringing stability to the country, not chaos, not disruption, not constant change. They want stability and predictability. Thirdly, they want candidates who will ensure security for the nation and safety for their families. The 4th S is that they want candidates who recognize America must be a strong country. And so the policies and actions that they'll pursue will be those things that strengthen the United States. And fifthly, they want sensible candidates, candidates with common sense. You may remember Mark Twain once wrote, "Common sense ain't." And that's one of the concerns that they have about candidates, is that they are not displaying much in the way of common sense with many of the extreme policies and statements and pursuits that they represent. The 4th thing that we saw in terms of messaging has to do with having a reasonable government. Increasingly, Americans are concerned that their government is not reasonable, that it's out of control. And so they want a government that's going to leave more of the decision-making power in the hands of the people, where they can make choices for their own lifestyle, where that government will facilitate self-reliance and independence because it's maximizing people's freedom rather than restricting it and rather than placing burdens on the American people. And then the 5th thing that we saw Americans embracing as kind of a common theme is that they believe we need to re-examine and perhaps recalibrate the character of the American people. What Americans told us is that they want a nation where people are compassionate and caring. And what that looks like is that you've got to be kind, respectful toward others, even those that you disagree with. And by the way, that's something that came out a lot in terms of the candidates. They want to see candidates being respectful of each other, even those that they sincerely and significantly disagree with. They want Americans to be honest and trustworthy and responsible and people who are seeking fairness in life. They want all of these traits to be modeled by the people who want to be their leaders as well. So these were the kind of themes that were coming out. We'll talk more specifically about some of the messages in just a moment. We also discovered that there were some themes that we tested that didn't come across as appealing. That's not to say that they wouldn't buy into some of these things, but they weren't as top of mind. They weren't as substantially significant to them as some of those other things. And that's that, you know, the idea of cutting back government regulation, of reducing security and safety, banning transgender females, moral truth and principles being the foundation of candidates and their campaigns, and the policy positions of existing officials, and on and on. We're not going to be able to go through all the different points of all the slides today, but you can see that, yes, there's a distinction in their minds of what's most important. So when we think about what's going through the minds of people, we talked a little bit about the messages. How did they get there? Well, part of it has to do with who they see themselves as being, who they want to be in the future. And the 2 critical elements that emerge from that is, number one, Americans think of themselves as citizens of this nation. And that comes with responsibilities and duties and obligations. And they're aware of that. They're cognizant of it. They're sensitive to it. Secondly, they see themselves as family people. This is vitally important to them. And so when they make choices, they're running it through a mental grid of how will this affect my family? What's most important for my family, whether it's their parents, whether it's their spouse, their children, their extended family. That's big for Americans right now. And that relates to when we look at values, and we'll get to some of those key values in just a moment. But we also found that their values are informed or influenced by their faith, even if it's almost subconsciously that that's happening. And you'll hear more about that in a few minutes. But faith does play a key role for most Americans in the shaping of their values and consequently their behavior. What are most Americans concerned about? Well, America's future is a big issue for Americans today. They're not just sitting back and enjoying the ride. They're very concerned about what the nation is becoming and where it's headed. What we found is that 3 out of 4 Americans say they are angry about the current condition of America. 6 out of 10 of them say, unless we change the direction we're moving in, America is going to be worse off 5 years from now than it is today. We found that most Americans, in spite of all the issues, the struggles, the challenges we face, 2 out of 3 of them said that they are either extremely or very proud to be Americans. That's on a 5-point scale. So that's your top 2 boxes on that scale, 65%, 2 out of 3. Most Americans, a majority of them said the federal government has too much power today. And what they want the government to be doing with the power that it has is not to be creating new problems, which is what many Americans sense is actually going on in Washington and in many state capitals. They want the government to be solving problems and dealing with people's needs. And based on what's going on in America today, most Americans say that they are not very satisfied with most aspects of their life, at least the 13 different aspects that we measured in this survey. Americans say that they want to be able to make choices in their life. They don't want the government making those choices for them. They have more trust in themselves than they do in the government. So we can look at some of the values that emerge from these kinds of opinions and attitudes. And what we know is that 3/4 of Americans tell us that they still support traditional moral values. Now, uppermost among those, 3 out of 4 Americans say that those values are driven by their concern about family, their interest in family, their love of their family, and happiness. That's one of the things that they believe the Constitution gives them the opportunity to pursue, and they want to experience that. In addition, we found that 2/3 of Americans said that critical values to them, values that they are literally willing to die to protect, or that they're willing to sacrifice significant resources to preserve, are values like personal independence, justice, kindness, character, trustworthiness, personal responsibility, integrity, the ability to grow individually, and the opportunity to maintain and own property. These are the kinds of things that are significant to Americans. It's different than what you hear in a lot of the political conversation on the news programs, but Americans are speaking their mind here and telling us what matters. You can see how that gets translated into what's going on in their lives and why they're concerned about so much of what's going on in America today. When we look at the different aspects of their life and what they're very satisfied with, there wasn't a single area of the dozen or so that you see represented here on the screen where a majority said they're very satisfied with that aspect. Tops on the list was their personal relationships. Interesting again, because this is the one area on this list that they control. And so the things that they control, they feel better about than the things that are controlled by others. But you look at all those other areas, less than 1 out of 4 Americans, in some cases, less than 1 out of 8, say that they feel very satisfied with what's going on in the other dimensions of their life. That, of course, influences what matters to them when it comes to voting. And this is another way of trying to figure out, what are Americans looking for in their lives? What do they want from their leaders? What kind of government do they want to support? And if you look at that list of issues on the left-hand side of the screen, there are 7 different issues there. Those were the 7 highest rated issues. And you find that essentially 5 of those are economic issues. Certainly inflation, the cost of food, and the shortages, gas prices and policy, jobs and unemployment. But also when we think about crime, the reason why crime has jumped up in this list compared to where it has been traditionally is that there's so much more crime taking place. Why is that? It's because of what's happening in our streets. It's because of what's happening in terms of urban policies that have essentially allow criminals to run free. Even if they're picked up by the police, they're not held in jails. They're not pursued in the courts. And so all of these kinds of things are uppermost on the minds of Americans, along with healthcare, which also, by the way, could be seen as an economic issue, because the number one element of healthcare that we saw people listing for us was the cost. They can't afford it. It's gotten out of control. And then the other issue also was a security issue, terrorism. You look at the issues of moderate influence, abortion, government spending, racism, immigration, the quality of education in public schools, poverty, and uniting America. All of those significant issues to America, second tier issues, but significant. You look at that lowest tier of issues, foreign policy. That's traditionally where Americans put foreign policy. They don't think about it very much. Although they're concerned about their security, they don't understand the dynamics of what happens globally. Environmentalism, the size of government, religious freedom, income inequality and trying to redistribute income, national morality, mental health, issues that pale in comparison to the significance of those other issues on the list. Now, we could look at all of these different matters, the messages, the values, the issues, by different subgroups or segments of the population. And we've been doing that. And it's very interesting because it does show some very significant differences by age group, by ethnicity, by party identification, by political ideology, by region, and more. And so we're continuing to go through all of that data and make sense of it. We've already gone through some of that. Let me share some of this with you quickly. I know time is of the essence here. So, quickly, if we were to look at messaging by generation, we would see that the top issues are essentially the same across most generations. But there are a couple of things that are significant here. One is that the most distinctive generation in terms of how they look at issues are millennials. They have a different way of looking at the world around them. They have a different set of values, as we'll see in just a moment. And so you'll find that the way that they look at things is different. And nevertheless, the ability to make their own choices, the ability to improve the economy, the ability to have leaders of character, that's high on the list for all of our ethnic groups. It's interesting, too, that when we look at the range, the statistical range for all of these different groups, it's significantly different. And so you look, for instance, at the builder generation, our oldest generation, people 75 and older. They are the ones who are ripping their hair out every day, most concerned about America. So even when you look at something on that chart that says, we don't need a new system or new laws, we just need people and candidates who are going to behave sensibly and act fairly toward everyone. It's interesting, even though that came in 13th on their list of messages, 80% of them said that that was a message that would cause them to be more likely to vote for a candidate espousing that message. So builders are most upset about virtually everything that's taking place in America. And so we'll look more at that later on. We can look at the values across generations. And again, you can see there are a number of things that are in common across all four of the generations that are voting in America today. We tested 48 different values. These were the top ones that emerged. Notice, importantly, family, number one, across the board. Doesn't matter which ethnic group we look at, which racial group we look at. Which generation we look at. It's really number one across all of those groups. And when we look for differences across these groups, here's something that we may be able to come back to later. Millennials, very, very different sense of what makes somebody a good person. Recognize that most Americans want to be good people. And so they're looking for ways to live a life that portrays them to and in actuality enables them to live as a good person. But look at millennials, how different their perspectives are on values. It really is a radical shift that we take in place. Big shift with Gen X? No, they don't have many things that are different than the norms. Boomers, a few things, primarily in how they differentiate themselves from millennials. Same thing with builders. They tend to be similar to the norm, except for some of those values that millennials are pushing. So very different points of view there that are important to recognize, particularly when we try to communicate with millennials. And if we look at the issues, again, the top rated issues, similar across all generations. It isn't until we get to the middle third and bottom third of the list of issues that we begin to see differences. So the things, again, that matter across generation are things like the economy, things like healthcare, things like crime. And so that's a steady across all generations. We could look then ethnically at what's going on in America. And again, we see that there are differences. Those are the things in the yellow boxes there, where we find the biggest points of differentiation. But nevertheless, when we look at some of the key messages, improving the economy, everybody agrees, regardless of their ethnicity, that that's critical. Things like having honest, courageous, hardworking leaders who are going to serve the people, not serve themselves, and who are constantly seeking to advance the best interest of the country. Yeah, all the groups agree on those things. Stuff like, restoring peace and unity, that can only be done when we have leaders who are going to model kindness and understanding, even with those people they don't agree with. They've got to respect everyone. That's a message that everyone is going to resonate with. We could look at the values of these groups. And again, pretty similar values until you get below the seventh or eighth ranked values here. And so Americans basically believe in, family, number one, pretty much across the board, happiness, personal independence, justice, character, kindness, integrity. Those are things that work with everybody. Trustworthiness, for the most part, with one exception, as you'll see there on the list. We could look at the issues, and once again, the top rated issues are the top rated issues. Doesn't matter what ethnic group you're looking at. There are nuances here, to be sure, but by and large, if we stick with themes related to the economy, related to enhancing family, that's the thing that's going to work across the board. We could look at party identification. Now, this is where you would expect to find the biggest differences, and indeed we do, where it's almost as if Democrats and Republicans are coming from two different planets. Except when we look at the economy, once again, what we find is even Democrats, independents, everybody is concerned about the economy. And so that's certainly one of the areas where, that kind of messaging is going to be impactful. Again, then you've got to figure out, well, who are we talking to? Who are we targeting? What kind of coalition are we trying to put together? And we're going to have difficulty attracting progressive Democrats, but they are not the majority of America. So as we look at our population and try to figure out who else can we attract, we understand that there are some messages that resonate with Republicans, as you see here. on this particular slide. And so, government spending is reckless. We've got to put an end to it. Justice needs to be one of the distinctives of America, but it's got to be fair and consistently applied. America needs to be a superpower. The world relies on us to keep peace across the globe. We've got to improve the economy, and so on. Socialism doesn't work. We don't have to change the system, maybe just a bunch of the players. When we look at independence, we see that they resonate with many of those same messages. For instance, the economy is something that we have in common there. Having good leaders, people who are going to be honest, courageous, hardworking, and serving the people, modeling, the right kinds of attitudes and behaviors, not needing to change the system, but needing to be sensible. Leaders with integrity, justice, upholding justice, stopping reckless government spending. These things are in common. So you can start to put in your mind, how do we begin to build coalitions, even if they're not exactly like us? We can look at some of the kinds of values that resonate across parties. Interestingly, we see that there are quite a number of things, quite a number of values that regardless of a person's party, they resonate with. So things like family, personal independence, happiness, kindness, justice, those are the kinds of things that it doesn't matter how you're registered, that registers in your heart as being the right way to live. And so pushing those kinds of values, again, will have greater resonance. There are, interestingly, some values that are embraced by Republicans, but that neither Democrats nor independents get excited about, or at least as excited about. Things like the Christian faith, patriotism, biblical morality, limited government, private enterprise. They don't understand those things. They don't get on board those trains nearly as easily. Religious freedom is an interesting one because Republicans see that as a big issue. Democrats, a majority of Democrats and independents hold religious freedom to be a value that they believe in, but it doesn't rank near the top of their values list. So while they're not likely to fight it, it's also not something that they're likely to fight for. We can look at the issues here, and again, you can find that economic issues pretty much cross party boundaries about what needs to be focused on. Economy and family remain major issues. We can look at ideology, and we can see a similar type of thing, where again, liberals and conservatives coming from very different places. I won't belabor this because a lot of this is similar, not exactly, but somewhat similar to what we just saw with parties. And so again, the same kind of messages resonate. Let's fix the economy. Let's make sure that people have the right to make their own choices in life. Let's get the right kind of leaders in office. And those are people of character being demonstrated by their honesty, their courageousness, their hardworking nature. They're doing this to serve the people. So those are the kinds of things that cross across all lines. We find that messages that there are some messages that appeal to conservatives, but not to moderates and liberals. You would expect some of these things, socialism not being viable. Liberals don't buy that. Moderates aren't sure. When we look at the don't know among those people who say they don't know if they really think socialism or capitalism is better, large numbers of moderates say, I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure that one out. Applying constitutional principles, big for conservatives, not at all big for liberals. Liberals have a whole different way of thinking about the Constitution. And so you can see all these kinds of things. Again, values, some core values that cross all ideological lines. Family, again, critical to everybody, but also things like personal independence, happiness, justice, character, integrity. Those are big deals to most Americans. Property ownership is to most Americans, except for liberals. They don't buy into that. Why? Because of Marxist leanings. We can look at the issues and how those rank. And again, across all of these groups, the economy comes out aces. You find dealing with crime something that's important to most Americans. And so again, we've got other things that we could look at, but we could look at regional differences And because of time, I'll tell you that, yes, we looked at this. Yes, there are regional differences, but yes, we see the same consistency across all regions. When we look at messages, it's please take care of the economy. Please let me keep my ability to make my own choices. Don't force things on me through government fiat. And we want better kinds of leaders, and we want to take care of our families. And so we see that across all the regions, same kinds of patterns that we've been talking about. So hopefully, I know it's a very quick, a lot of information in a very short period of time, but I'm going to turn this back to Mark now. And I hope that you see that, yeah, we've got some great data that gives us some good direction in terms of what kind of candidates do we need to support, what kind of issues should they be focusing upon in order to be able to build coalitions that will ensure that they get elected, and what kind of messages will get those candidates in front of people with the right kind of appeal. So, and of course, there's a lot more information that I'm sure we'll be divulging to you in the days to come. But let me turn it back to Mark now.
Okay, George, thanks so much. Well, the first thing that I would say, and the first statement I would make about these findings that surprised us, is that the culture of American society did find a point to cluster in for security and stability, and that's the family unit. Now let's think about that a minute. You think of all this data and how it can be broken out by region and different categories, and across the board consistently, that is the institution now that they trust. George made a point about people tend to like what they can control. And I would also say that what we found in this is that they also like by what they're not threatened. The family unit in society is the one unit that doesn't necessarily have as its objective to influence another family. It's not a religion. It's not a cultural mandate. It is something that everybody expects in the privacy of a family, that you will practice the values that you believe in. And so what we're finding here is that the public has a different mindset for the first time in the history of the country. There's no party identity on what they want in the future of the country. No one's saying they want to be the Democrats to lead or just the Republicans to lead. There is no consensus on exactly how they want even the federal government to relate to the states, other than they want the family unit protected. Now let's think about that again in another context. They tell us that their most important value is family, number one, and then happiness. And the other things that came out of the study, or kindness or justice or righteousness, those are adjectives of character and description of what they want in government, what they want projected in society. But the family unit is a physical structure. It is an entity, if you will, of which they exist. And then I would just make this statement to you, is that it is the family unit is the new institution of the value proposition. Now, as George pointed out in his chart about influential issues, moderate issues, not so important, it doesn't mean that they're not for those issues, whether it be transgender competition or abortion. It just doesn't directly, in their mind's eye right now, impact their family, and therefore isn't the priority. Now, if that's going to be different by state and by congressional district. But the point is to have some respect of building a mutual relationship with the public, whether we're a group or individuals, or we're journalists, or we're candidates running for office, to reestablish our contact with the citizens, that we respect their right to run and manage their family as they see fit. It's different in that in the past, we've driven them by issues, we've driven them by party, we've driven them by age, we've driven them by economics. And it's not that they're abandoning or changing their opinions on those issues. It's that it is now viewed through the lens of how it impacts their family. And we now have in this country, this it was the most startling number to me, even the wrong track. I mean, we've never had wrong track over 75% before, and we're now at 87. But that 65% of the American public does not trust candidates running for office to be telling them the truth, that they're influenced by somebody else or they have their own hidden agenda. We now, as leaders, have to find a way to help candidates reestablish their credibility before they even talk to them about the issues. And part of that is speaking to them in the terms that they understand on what they in what they feel threatened. And if you build that relationship, and then the 5 S's that George mentioned, that's all an attitude and who you have around you and the tone of how you present your information, and whether or not they believe that you're dictating to them and telling them how they must see the world versus you're relating to them to help them in the security complex that they're in now, the family unit. Okay, now, given that, as I said at the beginning of this, if you got questions, please hit that chat button and give them to us. We're going to start taking some of those now. And as I said, this is recorded. You can pull this down later, number one. But number two, at the end, I will give you a slide with an email address on it that you can submit questions to. And what are we going to do with this, guys? Tomorrow we have another seminar on coalition building. And it's a concept that you don't have to get 51% of every category that George mentioned. You do by region, I suppose, but let's say you're a Senate race or a congressional race. What you'll learn tomorrow is how you can pick and pull from each of from age or from ethnicity or ideological background or party, 15 to 20% of a group. And when you collectively add those together, you're at 51%. And relate to them, and they'll tell us in this. And another reason why we have so many samples is so that we could break this poll out by at least 4 quadrants. We may even be able to get it just a little bit smaller than that, based upon a large state with a larger margin of error. But to show the regional differences, so this can be applied nationally in this cycle. Now, the other thing that I'll tell you about this research is it is designed to have a shelf life of 3 to 4 years. Yes, we talked about current events. Yes, I think every single issue that's in front of the American public today in this election cycle was in this poll. And if you have a specific question about a specific issue, send it to us and we'll try to pull that crosstab for you. But this was a values research project. What are your deepest abiding values? From what well do you draw the emotions to come to the conclusions that you do if you have nobody to trust but yourself? And what they're telling us is that the family, and I'm saying the depository now of cultural values, as George said, it's partly by faith, partly by generation, partly by your parents, but it's still the well from which Americans are going to now to draw their strength from what they think about these issues. That won't change in 10 years. It's a generational analysis. And so this will be good through 23 and 24. Another thing that America's One does is that we address international issues on economics, other things that we think may impact America in the coming months and years. We'll be able to pull from this some of the ideas for policy that they're willing to sacrifice to support. And it all begins with that relation of, do I trust you to be telling me the truth as a servant to do what's best for me and my family and the country as a whole? Okay, George, we're getting some questions coming here now. And let me just pull some of these to hit you with. Number one, you had a slide that 72% believe in traditional moral values. That's a pretty big number. Explain that a little bit.
Well, one of the things about the research is we did not define for them what traditional moral values means to them. But I think when you look at the values that they fed back to us that are most important to them, they essentially defined it for us by the things they were talking about. And they were, certainly first and foremost, family is what they would consider to be a traditional moral value. And you look at the history of the country, you see that it was built on developing, supporting families, but the other character traits as well, whether we're talking about kindness or wanting to be a just person, All of those kinds of things that we identified are critical, I think, in looking at those traditional moral values. The one thing that perhaps we would not have seen in colonial America that we do see today in that list of values is happiness. I think that's become something that in recent years has become much more of a goal or an objective of Americans. And so it's taken on the aura of becoming kind of a core value that what we do should also facilitate our happiness.
Okay, George, thanks. I have a question here. I'll just answer for the good of the webinar. How was this funded and what was the purpose? This is a nonpartisan poll, privately funded, just for the simple purpose of trying to understand, either in business, in government policy, and just in supporting democracy, what does it take to reestablish this relationship that people don't see the country 87% on the wrong track? I know everybody understands this, but to have that many people say, I'm dissatisfied with government, I don't trust it. And it would normally break down into that I want more progressivism, or I want more conservatism, or I want an issue I don't think is getting enough attention. That's not what they're saying. They're telling us that their core values, they believe that the leadership of this country right now is not addressing their hopes, their fears, and their dreams for the future. All right, so this isn't Republican Party funded. This isn't Democratic funded. It has nothing to do with politics. This was a research project to try to determine how we all together. Then this webinar was by invitation only for leaders that I think we thought had the same heart for the country, regardless of an issue of our own agenda. Okay, George, the next question is, we hear a lot about millennials, the difference in age groups, particularly millennials versus builders and boomers. And you mentioned that they think differently. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because they came to the same conclusion, though, that family was very important. Everybody did. Everybody basically said family is the unit that I find my security. So what's different and the same, George, about millennials?
Well, yeah, that could be a real long discussion. Maybe we do a separate session on that someday. But I mean, in a nutshell, what we know is that millennials are a group that doesn't believe that absolute moral truth exists. They're pretty adamant about that. And consequently, what that means is they don't buy into facts. Keep in mind, they don't believe that most people are necessarily truth tellers. Or if they are, they're telling a different truth and that person embraces their truth. You get into this whole my truth issue. So what you have is a generation that almost as a default position now makes its decisions based on their feelings. So things are feeling driven. When a candidate goes out and talks about, a particular issue and starts quoting data related to finances, related to opinion and so forth, that doesn't fly with millennials. They don't believe it. They're not buying it. What they want is a sense of that individual or a sense of that issue, a sense of a situation. That's what they're going for, is how they feel about it. And what that means is that when they vote, they have different kinds of criteria that they're looking at in relation to a candidate. So the kinds of messages that may resonate with millennials are going to be different than the messages that resonate with boomers and builders, because those are two generations that are looking for facts. They want them to be verified. They want them to be credible. They want the person giving them to be trustworthy and to be able to support that person. But nevertheless, it's a whole different approach when you come to this. So they're looking for candidates who will listen, who are not necessarily going to be the angry candidate who is criticizing everybody and everything. They're looking for somebody who has a bigger picture in mind and a whole different demeanor as they run that campaign.
And then a follow-up question on that is, if the family unit is the depository now for generational values, you said it's a blend of faith and values and generations. What do you see as a positive that unites the generations in how they're thinking about America and family as they're influenced on applying that creed or that lens, that viewpoint to current issues?
There are a number of things that we could answer there. One of those, I think, goes back to family, and that has to do with children. When we look at people across all generations, they're all concerned about what's going to happen for future generations. And so that's one issue. A second thing has to do with their quality of life. Americans have experienced a particular level of lifestyle, and they're not looking forward to giving up any of that. And so the ability to maintain what America has been able to experience over the last few decades is something that I think drives them. But then there's also that desire to be a good person and to be around good people. So the whole issue of character, which came very strongly out of the value study, that's something else that I think Americans are saying, maybe we need to settle down for a moment and think about, how do we unite the country? It's probably not going to be around issues first and foremost. It may be around what kind of people we want to be.
Well, I think that's a good point. And I mean, it follows up to another question but besides family, one of the points that across the board, by region, ethnicity, and age, is that in the top three, they want courageous, hardworking, sacrificial leaders who serve the people, not themselves or special interest. And in analyzing that, George, how does a candidate carry that message with credibility so that the average person believes they're trustworthy? What is it? I agree, if it's not the issue, what is the process? What is the protocol? To take one step back from when I used to be a consultant running campaigns, I never had to deal with, gosh, do you believe what I'm telling you is the truth, or do you think I'm just pulling your leg? Do you see a connection to anything that they can do today that is representative of building that relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. Really practical. Thanks for asking that. I guess there are a few things that come to mind. One of those is that when you want to build trust with somebody, there are various things that we found are most effective at building that. One is that if you can explain your vision, what it is that excites you, what you're about, what you're going to commit yourself to, and you can excite the other person or other group about that vision, that's a starting point for saying, okay, well, we've got something in common there. We see something in the future that we believe in and that we want to grow, that we want to pursue. A second thing that relates to that then is values. What about your personal values as a candidate make that vision compelling and make you compelling as someone who's going to pursue that vision, hopefully alongside of that person or that group? A third thing that kind of comes to mind there is that you've got to go back to your track record. You're going to tell people, this is what I'm going to do. Well, why should they believe you? Very few politicians are trustworthy. Very few do what they say they're going to do. So if you are a trustworthy person, an individual of integrity, you've got to give them some proof. One of the things we had coming out of this research was people saying, don't tell me you're trustworthy, prove to me you're trustworthy. Give me some evidence. And so the track record is one of those ways of doing it. Maybe testimonials or another thing that, campaigns sometimes use. But as much as anything, track record is important. And then another thing that we find that's critical toward building that kind of trust relationship is listening. People need to believe that you're going to stop your agenda and your busyness long enough to listen to what they have to say, not just to hear it, but to really listen to what they're saying and to respect them enough to either incorporate that into what you're doing or to explain to them how that doesn't fit the vision and the values that you represent and why you can't do that. I think if people understood why sometimes our leaders reject some of the ideas that people have or some of the desires that they express. It would be easier to swallow when we see, okay, so that doesn't fit within this bigger vision of who America should be in your mind. And if you buy into that vision, it's like, okay, I'm part of the team. I'm not always going to get up to bat. I'm not going to get my way, but I see where we're going. I see why that does or doesn't fit. I am going to trust you in that.
Well, George, that's a wonderful answer. It leads into, I guess, our close. One of the objectives of this project is to help candidates the next 90 days establish that credibility and trust, number one, and to offer some proof that they mean what they say, and maybe even offer some policy. As I said, this is a 3 to 4 year project that we hope to consistently provide this information to those who actually want to lead America for the world, for freedom and liberty, and support candidates who believe that selflessly for what people want at the grassroots for their families. We hope to be able to help them when they're elected to address that same concept of family values to people about the policies that they want to implement and support them in that. And as we go through the 23 and 24 cycle, I think that we're going to find that the United States of America is going to be critical to world leadership. There's some problems coming economically that will probably impact developing countries more than ours. And our compassion to help the world to maintain what we represent as the one beacon of light for democracy is going to be important, not just for ourselves, but for the world. So tomorrow we have another webinar about the application of this in campaigns on how to define, identify, communicate to coalitions that add up to 51%, that allow you to maybe add some levels of contact and trust inside the electorate that you don't have right now. So for contact for us, for questions or general information, there's the website. And just send us your name, your contact, or what questions you may have, and we will follow up individually with you as we build this momentum for reconnecting people with leaders and candidates for the good of democracy. Well, thank you for joining us today. We're very appreciative of your time. We look forward to more contact with you and direction in the future as we continue to roll out this research. Have a great day.